Imagine working tirelessly to try to gain someone's favor, whether this is a parent, a boss, a friend, or even God, and never knowing if you've done enough to gain their happiness. This is the condition the Galatians found themselves in when some false teachers came and misguided them. But oddly enough, this is the same condition that many Christians today find themselves in. And what is that? Believing that to gain God's favor, you have to have faith plus works. Let's look into what Paul's opinion of this type of gospel is. Passionately affirms that justification comes by faith and not by works. Justification is a right standing before God. And here in Galatians 3, 1-14, Paul appeals to the Galatians' personal experience and also to the scriptures. And when he's appealing to the scriptures, he's going to appeal to Abraham's experience before God and try to use this story to prove his point of what he believes the difference between a faith-based religion and a works-based religion is. So what we'll have here is Paul, in our lesson today, in verses 1-5, Paul rebukes their departure from the faith. In verses 3-9, Paul gives a positive affirmation and saying that, in so much saying that what faith brings and that it brings a blessing. Then in verses 10-14, Paul gives a negative affirmation saying that a works-based religion will bring upon the worshiper a curse. So Paul uses pretty harsh language to affirm his belief and his stance. So look what he does here. He opens up and he says, "Oh, foolish Galatians." Now, in this letter, Paul uses the harshest language in his letter to Galatians than he does all of his other epistles. But he says this right here, "Oh, foolish Galatians," to Paul. The Galatians have become fools in deciding to trade a faith-based religion for a works-based religion. Paul thinks this is the dumbest thing that they could have actually done. And he can't understand why someone would actually do it. He says, "Who has bewitched you or hypnotized you?" To Paul, someone in the right mind would never actually switch a faith-based religion for a works-based religion. So then either you're not in your right mind, you completely lack understanding, you're totally misdirected, or you've been hypnotized. Someone's bewitched you. They've got you under a spell, because a person in the right mind would never do that. So, and Paul's flabbergasted at the very idea, the concept. He says, "Who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth?" So look at this right here, okay? "Was it before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly betrayed as crucified?" So let's look at this. To Paul, a faith-based religion is the only way to serve God. Now, let's break that down for a second. What is the difference between a faith-based religion and a works-based religion? Okay, to begin with, all religions in the world, except for Christianity, are works-based religion. Christianity is the only faith-based religion. However, Christianity is bifurcated in the concept, not by doctrine, but by individuals, by teachings of other people or other churches. And it is divided into two ways of living out Christianity. One is a faith-based and the other is a works-based. The Galatians began to try to serve God in this second manner in a works-based religion. Let me explain the difference between a works-based and a faith-based religion, okay? So we intuitively, down in our souls, we know that we have to have a right standing before God. So then to have that right standing, when we say right standing, we mean justified, to where between us and God, there are no impediments, and that we are on a good footing or a good standing before God. We feel that, okay? That's why even the atheist feels it. That's why when you ask them, a person, immediately ask them about morality, about religion, about the destiny of their eternal destination, or if they're an atheist, about morality, the first thing that people usually answer with is this: I'm a good person. The reason that they do that is because in their soul they feel that they have to have a right standing before God. Even if they deny him, they still feel it. Okay? So then, we know that we have to have a right standing before God. Now, what is going to place us on that right footing? Well, what places us on a right footing between each other is how we act towards each other. That's what places us on a good standing or a bad standing with each other. So what we do by nature is we apply those same standards that we do to each other, we apply them to God. But it won't work with God, okay? And here's the reason why it will not work, is because the most righteous person that ever lived, I don't care who it is, the most righteous man or woman that could ever conceivably live, and if you would assess their righteousness and then assess God's righteousness, the two are as far apart as the one end of the galaxy to the other. And that's not even doing it justice. Okay? So there is no way to match God's righteousness or God's holiness. The requirement, well, you have to keep in mind that God's holiness demands holiness. So then, is because if you come into his presence unholy, it would take away from the holiness of his sanctuary. So, in reality, God keeps sin away from him. He doesn't allow it near him. And if it ever did come near him, his holiness would destroy it. So then, we feel before God that we're not enough, and we're not. That's a right feeling, okay? So then, that's what Adam passed to us through as an inheritance, because he passed it to those of his offspring, and he could only pass what he owned, and that's what he owned at the end of his life. He did not own eternal life; he owned death and sin, so he passed that. So now we are the inheritors of it. So then, what we do is we try to work our way into God's favor, but we can never do it. So then, there's the only other way to gain God's favor is through faith of the works of someone else, placing that. Now, what we really do is we're placing something on an altar between us and God. You may be unaware of this, but this is in all old religions, the Jewish religion and all pagan religions, is they would set up an altar. And in setting up an altar, then they would lay something down on the altar. And this was called an offering. The offering that they laid on the altar was to bridge that gap between them and God, or to make amends for the disfavor of God. So then, but this is a true worship, okay? Because this is actually what it is in the court of heaven. We see this all through the Bible, that there's an altar in heaven. Okay, so then the question is, what are we going to place on that altar? What are you as an individual going to place on that altar? You see? Now, a works-based religion places their works on the altar. A faith-based religion, which Christianity is the only faith-based religion, it places, through faith, the works of another party on the altar. So, through faith, then by faith, you believe, if you're following a faith-based religion, by faith, you believe that the works that someone else did is enough to make amends between you and God, which you are the worshiper. It's enough to make amends. Now, you can only have one thing on that altar. You cannot have, which many churches do teach, that you can have faith plus works, which that is a lie. This is what Paul's tackling here. Faith plus works is a lie. You can't have both. You have to have one or the other. It's either going to be your works or the works of Christ. You cannot offer two offerings on one altar. Okay? So then, if you insist on offering works on that altar, that's going to be your works. So then the cherubim, as it were, that's in heaven will remove off of the altar Jesus Christ. He removes the works of Jesus Christ off of the altar and places yours up there. Okay? So then now Paul is saying, why would you be willing to switch? This is so foolish to me. He says, was it before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly betrayed as crucified? Now, see, look at the language here. Okay? So Paul is saying that this is to the churches where he went in his first missionary journey, Antioch and Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. In those churches, remember, prior to my coming, Paul is saying here, the law of works was always placed up before your eyes, and you people didn't want anything of it. You could not serve God that way. You knew you couldn't serve God that way, and so you didn't even try, because most of these were God-fearers. If you want to know what all of that, the difference is, go back to our first lesson there. So at any rate, these are God-fearers. You did not want it. But once I placed, instead of placing the law up before your eyes, which the law was your own righteousness and your own works, in the keeping of the 613 laws of Moses, I placed Jesus Christ up before your eyes, and I preached Jesus and him crucified on Mount Calvary. And I told you all that God would accept you into the full economy of God. Many of these people were Gentiles, or most of them were Gentiles. God would accept you into the full economy of God apart from any of your own works or your own righteousness. He would look at the offering on Mount Calvary, and he would accept that and let you in. You see, and I preached it publicly, openly. And he even says in another place that Christ was publicly crucified. You see, he was held up before all Israel and all the world. And you accepted it. So then Paul is saying to them, well, then who tricked you? Who convinced you once you came into Christianity? Look, friends, I asked the same question. When you were a sinner and you were caught in sin, I'll say this to you. If you have find yourself trying to gain God's favor through your works, through the keeping of some church tradition, or saying so many Hail Marys, or wearing a certain set of clothes, doing a certain acts, or saying a certain liturgy, holding a certain set of beliefs that are taught by a particular church, and you believe that you'll gain God's favor for that, and you're trying to gain God's favor, first off, I tell you, you know you're not happy. You don't feel right standing before God. Paul says to get you to switch that, when Christ called you and offered you salvation, were you doing any of those things? Any of them? You weren't doing any one of them. You may have been a sinner, or you were a sinner, but you may have been a drunkard, or a thief and a robber, or whatever the case may be, or you may have been a prideful religious person. However, when Christ came to you, wasn't it to you that the gospel was presented, that Christ said, he that believes in me, though you were dead, yet shall he live, and he that believes in me shall never die? You, at that time, you had no works to offer to God, and you just accepted by faith Jesus Christ. He was placed openly before you. Then who talked you into dropping that for the perpetuation of your salvation and going over to do all of these certain works? saying these Hail Marys or wearing these certain clothes to garner God's favor, or using this liturgy to garner God's favor? Who talked you into that? Because I will tell you, they bewitched you, Paul is saying. They used maybe swelling words or great cunning speech, but in doing so, they hypnotized you. You see? So look at this right here. So then let's go on to the next verse. Paul says in 3:2, let me ask you only this. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing of faith? So then, did you, when God came to you and you felt like God accepted you, whenever that was, what did you receive it by, that acceptance by? You felt maybe a joy in your heart. John Wesley said one time, my heart, talking about the time of his conversion, he said, my heart was strangely warmed. Whatever, each person has their own testimony. But whenever that hour was, what did you have to offer God at that time? The only thing you had to offer him was belief. And so then, if he gave it to you, salvation, through belief in the sacrifice of Mount Calvary, why did you switch over to your own works? You see? And when he gave that to you, and when he accepted you, you didn't have any works. So Paul's asking a rhetorical question here. You know, how did you receive it? Well, every person who's truly met Christ will say that, no, at that hour, I just believed and I was saved. You see, they didn't have any works to offer him at that hour. So then it was only by grace through faith. So then Paul is asking this rhetorical question. Now he's going to lean into this pretty heavily into his doctrine here at this point. He says, are you so foolish then? If that's what God received you and gave you salvation at the hour upon faith in the works of Jesus Christ, he said, then are you so foolish that you began by the Spirit? Are you now being perfected by the flesh? If you couldn't be saved by your own works, how do you think you're going to be perfected by your own works? If you could not even come near to God because of your works, how do you think that you will then be perfected through your works, through this many Hail Marys? And as many of our churches in the Catholic, Eastern or Western, or many of our holiness churches, they teach faith plus works. And you can tell some of them outwardly say faith plus works. Others don't. They won't admit it, be that bold. However, in all of their doctrines, they are that bold. Is because they believe that the person or the Christian who doesn't do what they are doing, whether that is using a liturgy or whether that is wearing a certain set of clothes or adhering to a certain set of doctrines, they believe those Christians that do not do those things are either not saved at all or not as in good standing with God as they are, those to whom do it. Well, I will tell you, if you actually believe that, you've got to examine yourself. Paul said, examine your own hearts. You have to examine your own self. If you actually hold that, then I will tell you, friends, you do not have Christ on the altar between you and God. You have your works. You do not have the works of Christ, because that altar will only hold one sacrifice. And you have already testified that if they don't have as good a standing with God as you do because they don't do the works that you're doing, then you testify, you are a testament unto yourself what sacrifice you have on that altar. This is what Paul is saying. See, this is why Paul is so bemiffed. Paul is flabbergasted. The fact that you actually did that when you had a perfect sacrifice up on that altar, that it was so perfect between you and God, it would gain you every bit of favor you ever wanted with God. And you willfully walked over and removed that from the altar, and you placed your own works back up on that altar. Paul is flabbergasted. He thinks, and again, his strong language, are you so foolish? You're just a fool. And to put it in modern context, and not to be so harsh, but Paul's like, you're an idiot. Why would you do something like that? I can't understand it. Why would you be so idiotic? See, this is the language Paul's using. Why would you be so dumb as to do that? You see, Paul's using extremely harsh language. And the reason Paul's using this harsh language is because he cannot get over it. Paul knew what it was like trying to please God underneath works. It was miserable. And but here's the thing is, when you were all said and done, Paul knows it. Look how righteous Paul tried to live. But Paul knew that at the end of the day, you never gain one bit of God's favor. God is no more happy with you than when you started. He's no more happy with you if you you wear all of these clothes, you say all of these Hail Marys, you do all of these tents, you use this liturgy, you do all of these things. At the end of the day, when all of the things you could possibly imagine. In one place, Paul said, if I give all of my goods to feed the poor, and I even give my body to be burned as a sacrifice, everything that I have, at the end of the day, God is not one bit more happy with you than he is the sinner on the street. Nothing. You never gained an inch. You see? And Paul is asking the question, but with this sacrifice over here, you gain God's complete and total unabated favor without reservation. Why would you go and do that? You see? I will tell you. So in a second, he says, having begun in the spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Then someone would ask you then, well, why would some Christians do that? I know why the pagan would do it, because to him, there is no such thing as a faith-based religion. But why would the Christian do that? And I like Paul, would be as in question as to why someone would do that, but I do know why many of them do it. Some, they do it because they've just been deceived. They've been told by their priest or their minister that if they don't do this, God will be angry with them. They will be unholy. They will be unsanctified. So then that's what they go to do. But others do it. So then they're deceived. And to them, I have pity for them. Okay? They're just deceived. They are miserable in their religion. They love God, but they hate their religion. Usually, that's what you find these people are in. And to them, I have pity. I feel sorry for them. But there's another reason why Christians will do this. And to this set, there's not as much pity to be found. You pity for their outcome. But this is why, is because they want to feel like they're just a bit better than the next person. They like looking down at other people. They feel like it gives them a sense of righteous power. And so then they lay on to religion certain creeds and tents and works to be done so that they can fulfill them. And then they can look at everyone else who doesn't fulfill them and count them as less and count themselves more holy, more righteous. And so they're not deceived. They do they do that so that they can feel more righteous. This is what Christ was making reference to as the Pharisees. That's why they did it. Now, the people weren't doing it necessarily for that, but the Pharisees were doing it. And he said they lay heavy burdens upon men's shoulders, grievous to be borne, but they themselves won't lift a finger to adhere to them. They lay on men the things that they like, the things that come easy to them. If you ever notice, they lay on men's shoulders a great weight. Well, look what the Catholic Church laid upon her ministers. She laid upon her ministers that they couldn't even get married. You see? Which Paul said, and Christ said, which was forbidding from, they would forbid from marriage, which was a doctrine of the demons. You see, they would lay these heavy burdens upon their ministers' shoulders. Well, look throughout the ages, how many men bore that weight trying to find favor in the eyes of God. You see? And others who did it, who felt like it made them more righteous, they're more holy when they abstained from marriage. Then there were other men who didn't feel like it made them more holy, but they thought it was a weight that they must bear and to gain God's favor. and to enter the ministry, a weight which God never did lay upon them. But what happened is they became fools. They became bewitched. You see? These are the type of burdens that are laid upon people. Paul is astonished, you see? And to address that thing of marriage real quick, well, Paul said that as a minister, he had a right to marry. He said Peter was married. He said, and when they tried to bring that up to in the Corinthian church, that doctrine that you should abstain from marriage, Paul said, hold on, I have a right to take a wife if I want to. And so does Barnabas. All the rest of the apostles did. And what, did only me and Barnabas are not allowed to take a wife? But all the rest of the apostles are allowed to get married? That was so foolish, Paul said. You know, he said, you're inventing doctrines, doing the same thing. Paul repeatedly faced this type of works-based religion throughout his ministry, and he continually combated it. So he says here, he says in the 4th verse, he says, did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? See, well, remember this right here. What does he mean by that? Did you suffer so many things in vain? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain? Indeed, that yet if it is still in vain, is because of this right here. When I'm going to put it in a modern context for you, and then we'll roll this back. When you were saved and you started to live in a Christian life, well, many of us have different testimonies, but we do have a commonality, is that those in our old life began to either persecute us or make fun of us, or start to say behind your back, he's weird or she's odd. You know, they got all caught up in religion. See, and they started suffering things. But you did it why was it that you were suffering at that moment? It's because you were so close to your old life. Okay? Now try to follow my train of thought here. You were so close to your old life. Well, at that hour when you were so close to your old way of life, you didn't have any works to offer God. So at that hour, when you were suffering persecution for your turn to God and accepting his salvation, at that hour, the only thing you could have relied on, because you didn't have works, was faith in Jesus Christ, faith in his works on Mount Calvary. Okay? It was at that hour that old life was so close to you that those people who were part of that old life would begin to persecute you, and the only thing you were holding on to was his works. But now, some time passed, you have some works now behind you. You have some ground behind you of what we would call righteous life, righteous works. Then you switched over and started now relying on those works that you have now done in the last year, 2 years, whatever the case may be, 5 years, 10, 30. You see, now you're starting to rely on that. Well, then go all the way back to your original salvation and those things that you suffered. Well, then you must have suffered them in vain. Because in that hour, you were relying on the works of Christ, not your own. So then all of that was in vain. If indeed it is in vain still, because you have the opportunity to jump back over to a faith-based religion and get back off of that works-based religion. You see? So that's what Paul says, if indeed it is. So look, okay, in the 5th verse, does he, speaking of God, does he who supplies the Spirit to you and also works miracles among you do so by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? So this right here, when God saved you, and in Paul's ministry, when he went through Antioch of Pisidia, these churches, Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, when Paul went through that region, there were many miracles by which the gospel was confirmed to the people there. Okay, so then the gospel was confirmed to them through many miracles. Well, then, did he do it at that hour? Did he do it according to your works? When the crippled that was healed in Iconium, or Lystra, in Lystria, when the cripple was healed, did God heal that crippled man because one of you pagans at the time, you were pagans, were righteous And God said, because of that, we'll call you John Doe. Maybe that's the person who was there. Because John Doe is so righteous and so holy, I'm going to give this paralytic his healing. Well, he didn't. What did he do it by? He did it by faith. You see? And then what's the biggest miracle that could ever be done is the fact that an individual can have a right standing before God and feel justified before God. And then that is the greatest miracle that any of you all could have felt. That's the greatest miracle God could ever do in anyone's life. But that is a greater miracle than parting the Red Sea, is to give you a right standing before God. Did he do that according to your righteous works at the time, the day he saved you? The day you found your salvation, did he do that according to your righteousness and your righteous works? Well, of course not. You didn't have any righteous works. You were a sinner. So then what is the basis upon which he performed that miracle for you? Well, he did it upon faith, because I said I believed. I accepted Jesus as my Savior. I accepted his works. I accepted what he did on Mount Calvary. So then it was by faith he did that miracle. You see? Then if that's the greatest miracle that can ever be performed, why in the world would you ever switch over to relying on your works? Now Paul is going to he's going to get into his story of Abraham. Now watch. Now remember, talking about having a right standing before God, and that to him, that was a miracle. He said, just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. You see, Abraham's faith was counted unto God, or unto him for righteousness, not Abraham's works. Paul said in another place, if righteousness came by works, Abraham may have whereof to boast before men, but he couldn't do it before God, because all of his works are filthy rags before God. You see? So then he could pound his chest before men. So then God accepted Abraham and called Abraham righteous, Paul's saying here. But he did it by belief, Abraham's faith in God. He believed God was righteous. So now, at that hour, now this is 430 years before the coming of the law. And at that hour, you had all the pagan religions of the world from the time of the antediluvian age till the time of Abraham. All of those 100 years, no one had ever served God by faith. They had served him by works. And God went up to one man and said, quit doing it that way and start following me. Just believe me. Follow me and believe that I'm good enough. Just start doing that. And Abraham said, okay. Never look at yourself from this day forward. Never look at your works. Just start believing that I'm good enough. In our modern language, start believing that God's got this. God will take care of it. I'm not worried about it. You see? God is enough. Did you say so many Hail Marys? I don't need to say Hail Marys. God's enough. Did you drag your carcass over cobblestones? I don't need to crawl over cobblestones and kiss statues. God's enough. Did you wear these certain set of clothes? I don't need to wear these certain set of clothes. God's enough. You see? Just start believing, Abraham, that I am enough. I will do it. And Abraham said, okay. And God said, Abraham is a righteous man now. Friends, that is astounding to me. And this is what Paul's saying. Just as Abraham believed God, and it was what was? What is the it here? Abraham's faith. Not Abraham's works. Abraham's faith. And it was counted to him as righteousness. The it is Abraham's faith. Just as Abraham's believed God, and it was counted unto him as righteousness. Not Abraham lived 30 years and did so many deeds and God counted him righteous because of these deeds. You see how many of us Christians switch over and are unaware, but we're switching over to a works-based religion, and it'll never gain God's favor. This is the condition where Martin Luther found himself in, because remember, as we stated previously, that you cannot serve God through a works-based and faith-based. You cannot be faith plus works. And you are going to have one or the other on the altar. And if you're trying to place faith of works on the altar, then faith is not on the altar. So this is why Martin Luther kept trying to please God. He kept whipping himself and fasting and starving himself and tormenting his flesh and sleeping out in the snow shirtless, and almost died because of those things. Trying to gain God's favor through his works. Praying so many hours and not sleeping, not eating, trying to feed the poor, studying so much, trying to garner God's favor. And so much that his priest said to him one day, Luther, you love God, don't you? Luther thought, he said, Luther, you love God, don't you? And Luther said, love God? Love God? I hate God. I hate him. And his priest was a kind old priest. And he said, Luther, I don't think it's God you hate, but I believe it's his church you hate. Because his church had laid upon him all of these requirements. But God did. And Christ said, come unto me, ye that are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Let me just stop for a moment here and give you an admonishment. If you're hearing this and you feel like that the weight of religion or Christianity and religion that you are currently bearing is not light and easy, you are not bearing the burden of Christ. You're bearing the burden of the church. That could be your own, of your own making. You made that up. Or it could be other people in ages gone by made that up. But I will tell you, you're not carrying his burden. You're carrying the burden of the church. Then Luther read that great battle cry of the Reformation, that the just shall live by faith. Faith in what? The works of Jesus Christ. Every single time that would come to him, that you're unrighteous, God's displeased with you, it would buffet him like the wind out of nowhere. Your God's angry with you. Luther would push it off through what? Through faith, and would push it off and say, Christ is enough. Christ is enough. Christ is enough. You see, Luther realized the just shall live by faith. You see? So then, let's go to, so Abraham started doing this. Now, watch what he says here. That the promise to Abraham by faith had a promise blessing upon it. In Genesis 12, it had a promise blessing upon it. But the law brought a curse. So there are two covenants to begin with. There are two covenants, two different ways to serve God. If you serve him, Paul is going to say, and we're going to read the scripture, but if you serve him by faith, there's a blessing that comes upon it because God's happy with it. And you will just feel that blessing upon your life. There's an air of freedom, a lightness that Christ had promised. Because what is the lightness? Why does it come? Is because the lightness comes because God is happy with your offering. And then there's a lightness upon that the worshiper's Christianity. But if you don't, and you try to serve God through works, there is a curse laid upon it, and you feel it every single day. That's why you can't feel free in your Christianity. That's why you feel burdened. That is the reason why you feel like somehow you never do enough before God. You never, whatever you've done, it's never been enough. You've preached the gospel for 50 years, and somehow it's still not enough. You don't feel completely free in Jesus Christ. Is because the curse that's laid upon that type of religion, there is a curse, and it's laid upon there, and you're feeling the weight of the curse. Friends, I would admonish you, remove all of that off the altar and start saying Christ is enough. Put Christ back on the altar. So let's look at this right here. He says, know this, in the 7th verse, 3:7, know this, that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. See, Abraham believed God. And Abraham believed God, and God was happy with Abraham. He was happy not with Abraham's works, but he was happy with Abraham just trusting him. Okay? Now follow Paul's train of thought here. God was pleased with Abraham just trusting that God was enough and that Abraham was not enough. Okay? So that's the thing God was happy with. Now, Abraham was a Gentile. Abraham, the nation of Israel didn't come until Abraham's grandson. Abraham was a pagan, uncircumcised, Gentile, whom God called to follow him by faith and believe that he was righteous and not, that God was righteous and not the law was righteous, and anything, or not the Abraham was righteous, and anything that was required to get Abraham into God's favor, get him into heaven, God would supply it. And Abraham knew that he wouldn't supply it. God would supply it, and he believed that God would. And God looked down, and God was happy with that. That faith bridged the gap between God's righteousness and man's unrighteousness. That was enough. You see? And God was happy with that. Okay, so then what took place then later is the fact that the Israelites in the wilderness wanted to be sagacious with God, and they wanted to rely more on their works and then find fault with God. And they kept putting a measuring rod between them and God, and every time they measured God as coming up short and themselves as coming up holy. You see? And they continued to put that measuring line in between them and God, feeling like somehow they would come out better in the long run. You remember when Moses in Egypt, when the Israelites were still in Egypt, they said, "Oh, Moses, you brought you and your God have brought a curse upon us. You told us to believe in God, and we did. Now Pharaoh hates us." See, kept doing the measuring. Again, did you bring us out when they were at the Red Sea? Did you bring us out here to die? Again, when they were thirsty, did you bring us out here to thirst to death? Wasn't there enough graves? There weren't enough graves back in Egypt. You wanted to bring us out here and kill us. You see, you and your God. They kept doing that instead of just believing that whatever the situation comes, first off, between God and I, God is the one who's righteous. He will supply all my needs. I don't need to worry about it. And anything that comes up, he will make the necessary provisions. This is the way God wanted the Israelites to serve him. But they kept bringing up this measuring stick between the measuring tape, the measuring stick between God and themselves. And finally, God said, okay, set them down at the table, Moses, as it were, this is proverbially speaking. Set them down at the table, like the table of the exchequer, and weigh them out. Works for reward, and the lack of the works for punishment. Weigh them out. That's what they want to do. So then let's just go ahead and do it. Let's set this whole thing up. And the Jews were happy with it. They thought, the Israelites believed that they had come out on the better end of the deal. So then Moses laid out 613 requirements. Do this, and this is the blessing. Don't do it, and this is the curse. Well, that sounds really good, right? Well, this is what our legalistic religion do today, and our Orthodox, our Catholic religions do today. And they feel like they come out better. You see, in the whole thing, they feel like they come out better. But at the end, there was a caveat that caught them, and does so even down to this hour to anyone who wants to follow a works-based religion. Here was the caveat. It said, guilty of the least is guilty of the whole. Any man who fails in one is guilty of every single one of them. And then there's all the curses as we went down along the way, that if you do this is the blessing. If you don't, this is the curse, the punishment. All the way down. And you feel like I did every single one. I kept 612. That one I broke. Immediately everything's retallied, and the curses of every single one of them come back upon you, because guilty of the least is guilty of the whole. Because here's why. If a person is a felon for a $510 crime, and he is considered a felon because he portrayed one crime that caused him to become a felon, or the guy who did 613 felonies and now he's arrested, what are both of them classified in the legal system? They're both classified as felons. A felon is a felon is a felon is a felon. You see? And they lose certain constitutional rights because of that designation. Here's the thing, is if you break one of them, just one, you no longer have right standing before God, and now you are a sinner. And as Peter had already proclaimed, we could not keep the law, neither could any of our fathers. There wasn't one who ever kept the law. Abraham didn't even keep the law, which there wasn't a law, but no one kept the law. Moses didn't even keep the law. No one kept the law. You see? Every man. That's why the Bible says the law had concluded that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Everyone. That's every person. I don't care whoever that person may be. The founder of your religion, the person you revere the most, no matter whomever that may be, think about it for a second. That person is a sinner. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I know in certain traditions we hold this person or this woman up to be sinless or this, that, and the other. But that's a lie. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and the law concluded that. So then, guilty of the least is guilty of the whole. You see? So then, the first covenant that God made with Abraham was a faith-based covenant. 430 years later, because of unbelief, the Israelites did not want to follow God according to faith and just believe that He's righteous enough. And whatever we need, He will supply our needs. They did not want to hold to that. So because they did not want to hold to that, God instituted the law. But remember, according to Paul, the law was instituted because of sin. So then you have a faith-based covenant traveling along, we'll say, we'll use in our mind's eye here for a second, traveling along as a direct line to Jesus Christ. And it's established by faith. 413 years later, the law was introduced, which instituted because of sin, the sin of the Israelites. Then you drop down, now you have a parallel line running, which is lower, and it was established by sin. The other was established by God's righteousness with Abraham. And that was established on the premise of faith. So it's God's righteousness. The others is established because of the people's sin. And now you have two parallel trajectories running. The one has a blessing upon it, the other has a curse upon it. Abraham was the initiator of the one that was running along top that had a blessing upon it, which was by faith. The Israelites in the wilderness were the initiators of the one that had a curse upon it, which was initiated by sin. Okay? So then, if you decide to serve God according to the faith, and you can at any time, even if you've fallen down, you always have the right to go back up. Paul addresses that later, because the one came first, so it had a federal headship. Okay? Because it came first, it had a federal headship. We'll get into this later. This is why even God came and Abraham paid tithes unto Melchizedek, had to give Melchizedek, the Melchizedekian priesthood, a federal headship over the Levitical order. So at any rate, you can go up there at any time and serve God by faith. If you so choose, if you do that, you are the spiritual seeds of Abraham, and that's what God was pleased with. That's what God had always intended, the spiritual seed of Abraham. He never even intended the natural seed of Abraham. The natural seed of Abraham, their way of serving God, had a curse on it. That's what Paul says here. So the first covenant had that blessing upon it. So look what he says in the 8th verse. He says, and the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel means the good news, beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. Why? How are all the nations of the world currently now blessed? Through Abraham. Because they took Abraham's way of serving God and not the Israelites' way of serving God. And in doing so, all of the nations of the world became blessed that took the people in those nations that took Abraham's way of serving God, they were blessed. Well, friends, you could look out through the world today. Look out through the world today and see what nations and peoples have a blessing upon them, and they rise to the top in the world scene. Isn't it those who received the Protestant message that the just shall live by faith? It's not because they were better than anyone else, because they weren't. Yet throughout the world, there's an overarching jealousy upon the Protestant nations that they seem to be above everyone. Well, here it is right here. Here's why. Is because they chose Abraham's way of serving God. And by choosing Abraham's way of serving God, a blessing came upon them. And when they put their hand forth, when it should have gone bad, it went good for them. When it shouldn't have worked out, it worked out anyhow. And it rose those nations and those peoples and those cities and those towns, those churches. It rose them to the top. But the other ones who wanted to do faith plus works, or in those that are in the pagan lands who just serve God by a pagan religion, which is works only. Look at the other lands where they either in these two where they just are pagans, or they have a form of Christianity which is a works-based Christianity, and they go try to serve God by works plus faith. Well, then remember, the faith-based is moved off. You're serving Him by works. Look at those nations too. Has any of them prospered in that in the last 500 years? They haven't. Why? Is because that form of religion has a curse upon it, and when you do something and it should work out, the curse makes sure that it doesn't work out. When you plant your crop and you're right ready for harvest, and then a blight hits it and you don't harvest it. Time and time and time and time again, generation after generation after generation, is because that way of serving God has a curse upon it, and God's not happy with it. You see? Well, if it would be that so for a whole nation, what about an individual? This is exactly what Martin Luther come to understand, that the just shall live by faith. So then, those who serve God according to faith are actually the spiritual sons of Abraham. They actually have a better claim to Abraham as their father, and the Abraham as the founder of their religion, than the Israelites do. This is what Paul's saying here. And the scriptures have foreseen that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preach the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations of the world be blessed. You are their father. You see? And how was he their father? Because they took his religion. You see? So look, in the 9th and 10th verse. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Those people who decide to believe God, walk by faith, looking at the righteousness. For everything someone says, do you know what you did wrong? You did this, that, and the other. And he says, it's underneath the blood of Calvary. Christ is enough. I believe. I know that I've often said this right here. If I get to heaven, and I get up to the pearly gates, and you know the old metaphor, St. Peter, open up the books and see if you can come in. Let's just use that metaphor for a moment. If I get up to the pearly gates, and they were to say to me, let's open up and look at the book of your life and see if you can come in here. You know what I would say to them right then and there? Don't even bother. Just tell me the path to hell. Where's the stairway that leads to hell? You see? Because I can tell you, if you're going to look at me for righteousness to get into heaven, I'll never make it. But if you want to slide that book aside and grab the book that says the life of Jesus, and you want to open it up and see if that proclaims something righteous enough to get me into heaven, well, by all means, that's the only way I'll ever make it. Well, friends, I'll be honest with you, that's the only way you'll ever make it too. Any man or woman who ever makes it into heaven, it will be by the blood of Christ and the blood of Christ alone. You see? So look, he says in the 10th verse, for all who rely on works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law and to do them. You see? So if you have ever in your life, go back in your mind's eye, and if you're relying on how righteous you are, you think you're just such a righteous person, go back in your mind's eye right now and look and ask yourself, have you ever committed one sin? Then you're guilty of every sin that has ever been committed. Because guilty of the least is guilty of the whole. This is what Paul's saying. Then every curse of every sin is now laid upon you. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and to do them. You're under a curse. You see? If you wonder. So then, you know something? In reading history, and I got to close this out. In reading history, okay, I was astounded many years ago when I read that the thing that brought us into, when I say us, I'm talking about the Western world into the modern age. And out of the dark ages was the soft harness. You say, what do you mean by the soft harness? When you put a yoke upon an animal, usually it was a wooden yoke. That's the thing that attaches the plow to the ox. And he pulls the plow because of this. It's called a harness or a yoke. It used to be made out of wood. And what would happen is you have to bust up that soil and fur up the soil, make it soft. So the animal would pull against it. Well, it would bruise his shoulders. That wood would bruise his shoulders. And then because of the bruising, it would cause him to not pull as hard as he had the strength to actually pull. So then he would just be busting up a minuscule layer of sod of the ground. And each day he wouldn't plow as far because his shoulders were hurting. And in the Middle Ages, they devised an idea of, why don't we put some padding on that? So they put a bunch of padding and covered it with soft leather so that it was no longer bruising the animal's shoulders. And it's called the soft harness. And when it did, well then, because it wasn't bruised, the animal would pull even harder and pull all day long and work longer. And when it did, it caused crop production to increase 10 times, tenfold. Well, then people were no longer starving, and it caused mortality rate to increase, or lower the mortality rate, excuse me. And it causes the production. People started having surpluses, so that with their surpluses they could sell. And then with this sale of surpluses, they would start buying things, and they slowly started becoming artisans instead of poor crop sharers. And it brought us into the modern era. And I think 2,000 years ago, Christ addressed this, and he talked about the soft harness. Before we even ever knew it, he said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy, soft harness, and my burdens are light." The plow that you'll pull for me is a very light plow. What is the plow you'll pull for him? He's enough. He is enough. And the soft padding on the harness is grace. Grace. I'm relying on Jesus, not me. Wow. Imagine living that type of Christianity. I'm relying on Jesus, not me. And when a problem arises or you see yourself as not quite righteous, go, yes, but I never was relying on my righteousness. I've always relied on his righteousness. I'm not righteous. He is righteous. There was one good man who died for all of us bad men. There was one righteous. That was him. I've never been righteous. I'm not righteous. They say, oh, you're a holy man. I'm not holy. He's holy. You see? My yoke is easy and my burdens are light. But if you go the other way, it's going to be a hard row to hoe. It is the pulling that plow is a miserable plow to pull. Your crops will never do well. There's a curse upon it. Your shoulders will be sore all the days of your life. You see? This is what Paul's saying, the law. This negative affirmation. He says, now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law or by their own works. For the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not of faith. Rather, the one who does them shall live by them. You see, your own works. It's not of faith. You're believing in your own works, what you've done. You're not believing in Christ's works. So then you're going to live by your own works. You're going to have to go, God, I was so righteous, I've done so. And guess what? Here's the thing is, while you're doing all of that, you're praying, God, please, I ask you to give me a better job. I need this better job, God. Do you know how long I served you, God? See, you're relying on your own works. You know what happens? God turns around and says, it's putrefied, and he walks away from the altar. And then you're sitting there praying and praying and praying to no one. And then you're going to live by that. You're praying to no one. He immediately became a bad stench in his nostrils, and he turned around and walked away from the altar. And that's what Paul said, and Peter affirmed, that the Israelites had served God for 1,500 years at the time of Paul with that, and there was no receiving of the sacrifice. You're going to live by it, and you have the judgments of it. You see? But anyone who wanted to step off of that trajectory and climb up on the higher one were more than capable of doing so at any time. You could do that right now. He says, Christ, 13 and 14 is our last verse. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So that in Christ Jesus, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. Promised Spirit through faith. You see? Now all the blessings of God can come back upon us if we will just believe him. Believe that Christ was enough. We have the blessings and we have a right to them. So, friends, along with what is our practical application? I ask you the right now to check your foundation, and in the days and weeks and months to come, and even in the years to come, always check your foundation. Where are you relying? Where is your foundation? Is it on how good you are or how good he is? How good that you have performed, or how well did he perform? How righteous your life is, or how righteous his life is? If you're wondering, always look back to Abraham as an example. Abraham never one time brought how righteous he was up before God. He brought up how righteous God was and how good God was, and that God was able to fulfill what he promised. And he believed God and believed that God can give me a child. I can't do it. I cannot give myself a child. You see, I am incapable. This is why God brought the child in. The whole idea, and with Abraham, brought the child in, and now said, Abraham, you're incapable of producing a child, now go to produce a child. Well, he's incapable. So that later on, so who's the only one who could bring forth a child? For Abraham, God. So that it could be applied to us that you're incapable of producing righteousness, now go produce righteousness. Well, we just concluded that I'm incapable of producing righteousness. See, same as Abraham's child. Well, then, if there's going to be righteousness produced or applied to my life, who is the only person who can do it? God alone. You see? So keep Abraham as an example before yourself, and you'll be the faith seed of Abraham. And you have a more right to claim Abraham than even the Israelites did. Then, in doing so, rejoice in the redemption that you have in Christ. The freedom. For any of my wrongdoings, Christ paid the price for it. Any of my lack of righteousness, Christ paid the price for it. In doing so, he gave me the Spirit as a free gift of God. So, in conclusion, the Galatians' own spiritual experience affirmed that salvation began by faith, not by human works. So did yours. The scriptural evidence that you want for this is look how pleased God was at Abraham. He even called Abraham his friend. It's because Abraham looked at God's righteousness. What if you could do that? Looked at God's righteousness so much that God could start saying that you are his friend. And redemption came through Christ. It doesn't come through works. Always remember that. Until next lesson, go in the fear and in the grace of Jesus Christ.